So nobody believed that this was possible. Nobody thought that you could crash Bugatti, buy it back, and nonetheless fix it. Well, that's what they said. What do you gotta say to that? I think we can.
There are moments in the world of cars that stop people in their tracks. Not because of a new model being revealed at a fancy motor show, or because a famous driver set a new lap record on a famous circuit, but because something happened that everyone in the industry, from engineers to executives to journalists, had said was simply not possible. These moments are rare. They tend to involve someone deciding that a rule everyone else accepts is worth challenging, and then actually doing something about it rather than just talking. The story of a crashed Bugatti Chiron Per Sport being rebuilt in a private workshop in Miami, without a single official Bugatti part involved at any stage of the process, is one of those moments. It is the kind of story that makes people question what they think they know about cars, about the power of big manufacturers, and about who really controls what happens to a vehicle once it has left the factory and been sold to a private owner. The answers that emerged from this story were not comfortable ones for the automotive industry, and they are the reason the story attracted so much attention far beyond the usual audience for car content online. And if that were the whole story, it would already be one of the most remarkable automotive tales in recent memory. But it is not the whole story. Not even close. Behind the technical triumph of the rebuild, a personal partnership collapsed in public. Legal threats flew in multiple directions at once, and a Miami car dealership filed its own lawsuit against the same manufacturer, revealing a pattern of corporate behavior that made Mat Armstrong's individual experience look like just one piece of a much bigger picture. To understand what happened, you have to go back to the beginning. A Bugatti Chiron Per Sport is not just an expensive car. It is one of the most exclusive machines ever made. Only 60 were produced in total. Each one cost several $1 million. The engineering inside is extremely complex, with a massive 8-liter quad-turbocharged W16 engine producing 1,600 horsepower and 1,600 newton-meters of torque. It is a car that most people will never see in person, let alone touch. So when one of these cars ended up crashing, getting written off by an insurance company, and landing at a public auction yard in Miami with a crumpled front end and a wrecked transmission, it felt like the story was over. The car was totaled. The insurance payout had been made. The world now had 59 drivable Chiron Per Sports instead of 60, and the one sitting in that auction yard was going to stay broken. That was a general understanding. The car's own manufacturer had made sure to reinforce that understanding by sending a technician all the way from France specifically to look at the damage and declare beyond any repair that could be done outside a Bugatti factory. There was no ambiguity in that statement. The message was clear. This car is done, and only we could have fixed it anyway. As it turned out, both of those things were wrong. The owner of the crashed Bugatti was Alex Gonzalez, a Miami-based content creator known online as FXA Alexgate. He had crashed a hypercar during a stunt, and the damage was serious. The front end had taken a direct hit. The airbags had deployed. The carbon fiber structure had cracked. The iconic Bugatti horseshoe grille had been destroyed along with the headlights. The transmission had been damaged badly enough that the manufacturer's own technician described the repairs as something that required factory-level work. The insurance company agreed. At one point, the quote for putting the car back together was $1.7 million. Given that the car itself was worth somewhere between $4 and $4.5 million on the open market, the insurance company decided it was not worth trying to fix. They totaled it, gave a salvage title, and sent it to the Copart auction. That could have been the end of the line for this particular Bugatti. But Alex Gonzalez had other ideas. He bought the car back himself at the auction, paying around $1.6 million at the bid, with the total cost coming to roughly $1.9 million once all the fees were added in. That was still a significant discount from what the car would normally be worth with a clean title, but it was a very large amount of money to spend on a wrecked vehicle that the manufacturer had publicly said could not be properly fixed outside of their own facilities in Moulchiam, France. Alex Gonzalez had apparently already been in contact with a British YouTuber named Mat Armstrong, a well-known figure in the world of automotive YouTube, who had built his reputation and his channel of more than 3.2 million subscribers by doing exactly the kind of thing Bugatti said could not be done. Armstrong had rebuilt Lamborghinis, McLarens, and other high-end supercars that had been written off and sold at salvage auctions. He was the kind of person who looked at a total exotic car and saw a project rather than a loss. In the end, Gonzalez kept ownership of the car and brought Armstrong in as the lead mechanic on the rebuild. What followed was one of the most watched, most talked about, and most legally complicated automotive stories the internet has seen in years. Before Mat Armstrong had even started taking the car apart, Bugatti made his position absolutely clear. The manufacturer had locked the vehicle identification number of the crashed Chiron per Sport. That sounds like a technical detail, but the practical effect was enormous. It meant that no authorized Bugatti dealership anywhere in the world would sell parts for that specific car. Not the headlights, not the hood, not the wings or the horseshoe grille, not the transmission components or the airbags or any of the 10 radiators the car uses. Every single official channel through which someone might try to source genuine Bugatti replacement parts had been closed off before the first wrench had been turned. This was not a mistake or an administrative error. It was a deliberate decision. Bugatti had decided that this car would not be rebuilt outside of their own factory, and locking the VIN was how they enforced that decision from a distance. The message was the same one the technician had delivered in person at the auction yard, just expressed through corporate policy rather than a personal opinion. This car belongs in France and nowhere else. Alex Gonzalez did not take this quietly. He issued a public ultimatum to Bugatti, giving the company 24 hours to remove the VIN lock, or he would begin manufacturing the parts himself using three-dimensional printing technology. This was an audacious move. It forced the company to make a choice. They could either engage directly with the situation, which would mean acknowledging it publicly, or they could stay silent and watch a content creator begin documenting what happens when you replace a Bugatti transmission component with something made on a 3D printer. Both options carried risks for the brand. Staying silent looked weak. Engaging meant admitting that the situation was real and significant enough to respond to. In the end, the chief executive of Bugatti himself, a man named Mat Armstrong, reached out to Alex Gonzalez directly. That message was made public by Gonzalez. Rimac told him not to 3D print the parts and confirmed that the VIN lock had been removed. The car was no longer blacklisted. It was a significant moment, and it showed just how much attention the story had attracted at the very highest levels of the automotive world. Rimac also posted a video on Instagram addressing the situation publicly. He said that a lot of what had been said online about Bugatti's service costs and the complexity of their repairs was not accurate. He explained that there were only 2 places in the world with the equipment, and the trained staff needed to separate the rear subframe from a monocoque, the structural core of the car, which is a necessary step after a major crash to check for hidden damage. He pointed out that the gearbox housing had shattered and that the carbon fiber monocoque had been structurally damaged, which raised serious safety concerns about what could go wrong if those repairs were not done correctly on a car capable of the extreme speeds a Chiron per Sport was designed to reach. He also cleared up one widely shared rumor that a set of Bugatti Chiron headlights cost $150,000, saying that figure was not accurate. He said Mat Armstrong was welcome to bring the car to the factory in Motium. He also revealed that Bugatti had made what he called a fair offer to carry out the repairs themselves, and that Alex Gonzalez had turned it down. Rimac suggested the decision to refuse the factory offer had been driven more by the content potential of an independent rebuild than by any financial logic. It was a pointed observation. It was probably not entirely wrong. Mat Armstrong's response was honest and direct. He said on camera that it was genuinely shocking to him that the chief executive of Bugatti was watching his videos and had made a response video about them. He was not dismissive of Rimac. He said he found the whole thing extraordinary. But he was also very clear about what he was going to do. The car was not going to France. His reason was simple and immediately made sense to anyone who had followed the story. Once that car goes to Bugatti in Motium, he said, it stays there. Then they take it apart and find more problems, and the price just keeps going up. The concern was not whether Bugatti could fix the car. The concern was whether anyone would ever see it again once it was inside the factory. Later, in an interview on the Cars and Money podcast, Armstrong described his relationship with Rimac as something like a Messi and Ronaldo dynamic. Respectful at a basic level, but with the internet having turned the distance between their positions into something much more hostile than either of them had actually experienced in reality. Armstrong also said he believed parts had been denied to him because someone inside Bugatti's corporate structure had vetoed any sale, even at a point when Rimac had apparently suggested a sale might be possible. In his telling, a significant part of what made the project so difficult was the internal politics of a very large company trying to manage a situation that had become far more visible than it had ever intended. What Mat Armstrong and his team actually accomplished during the rebuild of the Chiron per Sport, without any official Bugatti parts and against the stated position of the manufacturer, is remarkable when you look at the details. The first and biggest technical challenge was the transmission. Mate Rimac had said publicly that only 2 places in the world could split the car to access it. What Armstrong's team found when they actually tried it was far less complicated than that claim suggested. They removed the air boxes and found 14 structural titanium bolts holding the front section of the car to the rear drivetrain frame. Once those bolts were removed, along with the battery terminals, coolant lines, and electrical wiring, the 2 halves of the car came apart. It required patience and careful, methodical work. It did not require equipment that only existed in Motium. When the car was split, the crash damage that had not been visible before was revealed. The impact forces had pushed the engine forward, crushing a coolant pipe and exposing additional damage that no one had been able to see before the split. But the procedure itself had been carried out successfully by an independent team, which directly contradicted what the manufacturer had implied was impossible. The damage bracket between the engine and the gearbox, which Bugatti's own assessment had identified as a main obstacle to any repair, was solved by a method that was both clever and practical. The team three-dimensionally scanned the original bracket, converted the scan into a computer-aided design model, and then used a CNC machine to cut a replacement part from a solid block of aluminum. The level of precision required for this was extremely high. If any of the crank sensors on the machine replacement were even slightly out of position compared to where they had been on the original, the engine would either not start, run badly, or behave erratically under boost. The transmission mount was welded back into position, and the same 14 titanium bolts that had been removed to split the car were used to put its 2 halves back together. The reassembly was not without its own problems. At one point, a crank sensor became stuck and could not be turned far enough to connect its plug, which would have meant splitting the car apart all over again just to fix it. Armstrong's solution was to cut a small access opening in the body that allowed the team to reach the sensor without having to undo all of the reassembly work. It was not the kind of elegant, factory-perfect fix that Bugatti would have produced, but it was functional, it worked, and it was all done on camera for the world to watch. The front chassis repairs were handled with the help of a mechanic named Bob, who runs his own YouTube channel called The Machine Shop. The interior of the car was completely stripped out, fully overhauled, and retrimmed by a company called E3 Customs, who matched the same white and purple color theme that the car had worn before the crash. One of the most surprising solutions in the whole project involved the airbags. Finding replacement airbags for a totaled, blacklisted Bugatti was never going to be easy. The team's solution was to source 2 airbags from an Audi A3 that turned out to be perfectly compatible with the Bugatti's airbag system. All 10 of the radiators, which had been destroyed in the crash and could not be sourced through any official channel, were custom built from scratch as replacements. A pinch coolant overflow pipe that needed fixing mid-build, and for which no Bugatti parts were available, was repaired using a section of rigid brake hose. In passing, Armstrong also noted something that many people found both funny and revealing. The accelerator pedal in this $2 million car was simply a piece of molded plastic, not the precision billet aluminum component that the price of the vehicle might lead you to expect. The exhaust system was sent to a company called Valvetronic, who created a completely custom system by scanning the original. People who heard the finished result described the sound as deeper and more aggressive than the standard setup. There was one more serious complication that showed just how close the project came to disaster at certain moments. The Chiron had been driven at some point before the rebuild began without any coolant in the system. On an engine as complex and as expensive as the one in a Bugatti Chiron per Sport, that kind of thermal stress is potentially catastrophic. If the engine had been cooked by the lack of coolant, the entire project could have been over right there. But when the cooling, fuel, intercooler, and engine management systems were all reconnected and tested, the team found that the cooling system had survived. By March of 2026, The engine was running again. The car went into gear and began to move. The automotive press covered it with the kind of energy that is usually reserved for events that people had genuinely believed would not happen. A company with enormous resources and a very strong interest in maintaining the idea that their cars could only be properly serviced by themselves had publicly stated that this rebuild could only happen in France. It had happened in a private workshop in Miami without a single authorized Bugatti part involved. The manufacturer had been proven wrong, in public, on camera, in front of millions of people up to the point when the engine started. The story of the Chiron Per Sport rebuild was a straightforward triumph. The underdog had beaten the institution. The independent builder had done what the manufacturer said could not be done. The audience that had been following the project for months was celebrating, and the automotive community was buzzing with excitement about what the rebuild meant for independent repair rights and the question of what manufacturers are actually allowed to restrict when it comes to cars that someone else legally owns. People were sharing clips of the engine starting. They were posting about the moment the car moved under its own power for the first time. The comment sections were full of people saying that this was proof that the so-called technical complexity argument was really just a commercial argument dressed up in engineering language. For a while, it felt like one of those clean, uncomplicated victories that almost never happen when individuals take on large institutions. But even as the project was hitting those milestones, something else was happening in the background that the public was only partially aware of. And when it came into full view, it changed the tone of the whole story completely, replacing the clean narrative of triumph with something far more confusing and human. In April of 2026, videos began appearing on social media, making serious allegations about what had happened behind the scenes between Alex Gonzalez and Mat Armstrong during the course of the rebuild. These videos spread across TikTok and YouTube. Content creators covering the story used words like scam and fraud in connection with Armstrong's involvement in the project. A YouTube video titled "Alex Gonzalez Just Revealed the Truth About Mat Armstrong" attracted a large amount of attention from the automotive community that had been watching the rebuild. A TikTok video titled "Mat Armstrong's Bugatti Scam Exposed" reached a significant audience from the same group of people who had been watching the car come back to life over previous months. The specific details of what exactly was being alleged were not confirmed by any credible outside reporting. Whether formal legal action had actually been started by either man against the other was not established by any verified source. Mat Armstrong maintained a broad public silence on the specific accusations while continuing to post content about his work. What the circulating video suggested and what the automotive community began to piece together from the available information was that the relationship between the two men who had collaborated on one of the most ambitious and publicly documented automotive rebuilds in YouTube history had broken down seriously. The shift in tone was visible and significant. Content that had been celebrating what they had accomplished together against a common institutional opponent had turned into accusations of wrongdoing. The audience that had been following the rebuild for months was left trying to make sense of a situation that neither of the main people involved had chosen to explain in full. The comment sections of related videos and automotive forums filled up with the same questions any reasonable person would ask. What exactly had gone wrong? Who was responsible? Was the rebuild itself somehow part of the problem? None of these questions were answered definitively by any verified source. What the public record of the rebuild itself had clearly established was that the project had succeeded at what it was supposed to do. The car moved. The manufacturer's claim that independent repair was impossible had turned out to be more of a qualified business position than an absolute statement of technical fact. But the crowd that had watched the triumph was now watching something considerably messier and more human unfold in the same public space where the rebuild had been celebrated. The online allegations also added a legal dimension to a story that was already complicated enough on its own. Mat Armstrong confirmed in an April 2026 YouTube video that he had received legal threats from Bugatti, which meant the manufacturer's engagement with his projects had moved beyond the CEO, making Instagram response videos into territory that required real legal awareness on his part. The exact nature of those threats and how they had been communicated was not publicly disclosed in detail. But the fact that Armstrong was willing to talk about them openly implied that the situation had escalated beyond an informal editorial disagreement into something with more formal and serious implications. The community watching all of this was trying to absorb a story that had started as a rebuild video and had expanded into something touching on manufacturer authority, intellectual property, the rights of car owners, the ethics of content creation partnerships, and the legal frameworks that govern all of these things. While the Chiron Per Sport rebuild attracted most of the public's attention, Mat Armstrong was also working on a separate Bugatti project at the same time, and what he discovered during that project turned out to be just as significant in its own way. He had purchased a repossessed Bugatti Veyron, the older and slightly less extreme model from the same manufacturer. The car had supposedly been sold because of a broken gearbox, but when Armstrong began examining it, the reality of the problems turned out to be both more straightforward and more revealing than that description suggested. The Veyron had several mechanical issues. It would not go into gear. It was misfiring on some cylinders. One of its radiators was leaking, and the wiring to the gearbox pump had been damaged by heat to the point where the plastic casing had perished and fallen apart. Armstrong traced the wiring problem to an interesting design choice. The gearbox pump in the Veyron uses the same basic unit as the roof mechanism on an Audi A5. This pump activates every time a door is open in order to prime the hydraulic system and holds 55 bar pressure while doing so. In the Bugatti application, that pump is being pushed to its absolute limits. When a relay sticks, the pump runs continuously until the wiring eventually burns out. Armstrong replaced the blown fuse for $3. The no-gear problem that had suggested a major mechanical failure, the kind of failure that might be used to justify a very expensive repair bill, turned out to come down to a single blown fuse. Once that was replaced, the car started moving. It was a simple fix, but the implications of finding it were significant, because when Armstrong then tried to source parts of the Veyron through official Bugatti channels, the answer he received was the same one he had already heard in connection with the Chiron. The company would not sell parts to anyone outside of its authorized service network. The car would have to be brought in and serviced by Bugatti directly. Armstrong described this as a legal mechanism that gave the manufacturer the right to prevent any independent work on its cars, regardless of how competent the owner might be or how willing they were to take full responsibility for the outcome. But the real story from the Veyron project was not about parts restriction. It was about what was actually inside the car. When Armstrong began working to mechanical systems of the Veyron, he found that a very significant number of the parts inside, it were standard Volkswagen Group components, not similar parts, not parts designed to the same specification. The same actual parts used across the group's much more affordable vehicles. The accumulator